What up, y'all? This is Patrick Hayes, and this video is about shadow work. What I want to talk about in this video is something that I like to call shadow pleasures. And this is really, really important when doing shadow work, to become aware of our shadow pleasures and start working on our shadow pleasures, because oftentimes this is the saboteur. This is what is sabotaging our success. These pleasures that our shadow gets out of sabotaging us, right? So what I want to do is I want to tell a little story of how I first interfaced with these different demons or aspects of consciousness that had shadow pleasures that were playing out within me, and what that was like for me, and the insights I had into the nature of what this kind of consciousness is. And then I also want to talk about the importance of becoming aware of that, some of the techniques for being able to become aware of that, and then some resources for being able to figure out how to heal from these sabotorial shadow pleasure aspects. So the first time I ever experienced this, it was really a trippy story, actually. It was probably almost 20 years ago now, at least 17 years or so. I was smoking DMT. And I took a hit of DMT. Now, mind you, at this point in my life, I was very, I was doing all sorts of drugs, and I was on opiates at the point when I did this. So I was very woven deeply into the underworld. Now, I took a hit of this DMT, and there was this demon being that jumped inside my body, and it said, "I am you, and I'm taking you down." And it started just like dragging me like deeper and deeper. It's a creepy experience. It's even weird to think about it when I'm telling the story. But I got a very clear understanding and firsthand experience of this essence of a demon consciousness, which was obviously interfacing with my consciousness in a certain way, and was obviously inside my energy field. And the nature of this kind of sabotorial essence. And the nature of it is was very interesting, and I've had several experiences over my life, distinct experiences with this kind of demonic consciousness. And one of the ways of describing it is that in one sense it hated doing what it was doing, but it couldn't stop. So it was like extremely tormented. And this is very much how the consciousness of an addict is in many ways. So I'm very much taking responsibility for my side of that. It wasn't just an external demon. I was attracting that demon because I was harmonizing with that consciousness. But this idea of doing something that is destructive to yourself, but feeding on it, right? That was what this consciousness was like. So it was, the words were, it hated doing what it was doing, but it was like ravenously chasing it and getting this like sick pleasure out of it also. And so the kind of consciousness is very much like a cannibalistic kind of consciousness. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because this is the kind of consciousness that is the saboteur within us, right? Now, that's a very salient and blatant explanation of it, but it operates in much more mysterious and much more subtle ways within us. But oftentimes what it is there's this certain direction of like a subpersonality or a demon or whatever you want to call it. There's a certain aspect of our consciousness that moves in a direction of self-sabotage. And I like to describe it as cannibalistic. It's very cannibalistic in nature, where it likes to, it's getting some sort of feed off of itself in a cannibalistic way. So if you could imagine like a ravenous wolf that decides that it's so hungry that it starts eating its own limbs, right? It's kind of a horrific idea. But that's very much what we act like, or what some of the demon attachments that people have are like. And so the saboteur within us very much acts in this way oftentimes, where it gets some sort of sick pleasure out of sabotaging ourselves, or in a sense eating ourselves. So it's like it's so ravenous, and it's getting a pleasure out of the taste of eating its own flesh, but it's also being tortured by the act of eating its own flesh. So I know that's kind of graphic and gross, but I think it's something to address, because it's actually quite accurate in my experience of the kind of essence that is going on inside a sabotorial structure within our psyches. So The reason why I bring this up is because when we are able to identify what those shadow pleasures are, meaning what is it that is actually creating that pleasure. So in the metaphor, the pleasure would be, well, you're so hungry that the taste of the flesh is actually some sort of pleasure that you're getting, even though it's torturing you on the other side, right? But more accurately, what I can speak from as my experience was, when I was a child, it was very, very difficult to get any sort of positive reinforcement in a satisfying way from the elder people in my environment. And what I found at a young age was that the only time I felt like I was paid attention to was when I was in pain or when I was going through some sort of drama. So what I identified later on in my path was that when I felt like I wasn't heard, I would start hurting myself, do some sort of thing that was dramatic in my life that hurt me to draw love attention from other people. So I felt love from people when I had some sort of drama going on, because then the people would turn and pay attention to me. And so I would actually destroy myself in order to get love. So the feed was love, the distorted form of love coming from other people that were really feeling pity for me or feeling sorry for me, or that came to serve me in a moment of distress, right? And I was feeding off that at the expense of myself, because I was putting myself through treacherous, painful situations and causing drama where there didn't need to be drama in order to get that attention. This is a good example of how this can play out in our everyday lives. So the key here is to become aware of the particular shadow pleasure, right? So most people, when you talk about hardships, when you talk about negative states, like I keep getting angry, I can't stop getting angry, or I keep getting frustrated, or I'm having jealousy issues, right? We always focus on it from the perspective of, well, we hate that experience. We don't like it. We don't want it anymore, but we can't figure out why we don't stop doing it. Well, the truth of the matter is it's very much like a drug addiction. Later down the path of a drug addiction, it becomes very clear to the drug addict that you don't like the drug, but you do like the high. So you have this like split relationship with it where you're getting this pleasure from it, but at the same time it's destroying you. So it's torturous, yet you're getting pleasure out of it. And what most people aren't able to recognize in their own emotional addictions is the pleasure side of it. They won't admit to themselves that there's a part of their consciousness, there's a part of themselves that is, and you could say maybe it's a demon, so maybe it's not actually a part of themselves, but for the purposes of this video, there's a part of yourself that is getting pleasure out of this experience. So how can you identify that part of yourself, right? And when you identify it and become aware of that essence, that part of you that maybe is fueling yourself off of getting angry with people, right? You get some sort of feeding off of it. And even though it's not a pleasurable experience, there is some sort of pleasure that you're getting out of it in a distorted way. But when we're able to identify that and look at it, then we're able to identify the essence of that dysfunction. And through the identification of the essence of that dysfunction, we can start noticing it when it's subtly popping up. See, because when these things rear their heads and they take over our actions, right? These negative subpersonality, then we become fully unconscious, in those moments. And so there's not very much hope for being able to understand what's going on in that moment. But if we're able to understand the essence, become aware of what that essence feels like, then when that essence starts creeping up into our energy field in a subtle way, we can become aware of that while we still have, say, 1 foot in consciousness. And we can start being aware of how that might start influencing our thoughts or our decision making that essentially is trying to lead us down a path to where that dysfunctional subpersonality or mentality or energy state can flare up, become inflamed, and take over our consciousness. So when we become aware of that, essence, then we can start, watching it And we'll notice that actually that essence is in some situations always around, kind of in the background. Other times it gets triggered and kind of starts bubbling up and creeping up from the background, and then starts influencing our thoughts and our behavior, and trying to, take us over. Now, Eckhart Tolle will call this the pain body, right? So there's a lot of different names. You can think of it as demons, because that's quite accurate. There are other beings operating, in this co-creation. You can think of it as subpersonalities. That's what psychology would call it. You can think of it as the pain body. There's a lot of different ways of thinking of it. But essentially, it is like an energetic momentum that brings a level of unconsciousness to us that takes over, in a sense, cannibalizes ourselves and other people through negative emotions, and it causes more destruction in our lives. And by identifying that level of consciousness and the essence of that consciousness, we can start becoming aware of it and not letting it take us over, right? But that requires awareness. So this is mindfulness, right? And that's definitely one major step in being able to overcome it, is becoming mindful of it so that we don't let it take us over. Now, there are other techniques for being able to go deeper. You can do shamanic work with different shamans. Some psychotropic work can be really helpful for this if you have the right shaman or the right healer there with you. Or you can also do one that I highly recommend. There's a book called The Caves of Power by Sergio Magana. Sergio Magana is ancient Toltec dreaming tradition, and he has really, really powerful practice called the Caves of Pleasure, where you identify these different aspects of your consciousness that are getting pleasure out of the destruction, out of the darkness, out of your own turmoil, and you bring them to into the light of consciousness. So in the practice, you pull it up from your lower abdomen, actually more like the genital area, all the way up into your throat, in which you make it conscious, and then you clear it. So because once it becomes conscious, when you're conscious that this thing is trying to take you over, then it has much less power, and it becomes more of a conscious decision than this thing that just kind of like rears its ugly head, and then afterwards you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that, right? So bringing it to consciousness is super, super important. So I would check out that book, Caves of Power, if you haven't already checked it out, because that is an amazing resource for being able to work with this. And then, like I said, mindfulness meditation, becoming mindful of these things, being willing to admit that there is some sort of sabotorial aspect to our consciousness that is gaining some sort of pleasure out of our own destruction, is a major, major key in being able to heal ourselves. So many people aren't willing to do that. They're not willing to say, you know what, there's an aspect of my consciousness that is actually getting pleasure out of all these things that I'm labeling as pain, right? And until we're able to identify that and admit that within ourselves, it's always going to be operating from behind the scenes, because it's still remaining a shadow. It's still subconscious. So a major key to shadow work is being able to admit that we have a shadow, and in this case, admit that the sabotorial aspects of our consciousness are gaining pleasure out of these destructive patterns and habits that we keep exhibiting in our lives. So I hope that was helpful. That's all I have for you today on that. If you have any other questions or comments, put them in the comments below. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Patrick Hayes. Like, subscribe, and share with your friends, and I will talk to you next time. One love.